September 20th, 1996. Belgrade, Montana. The air was crisp, the kind of afternoon that called a fisherman to the water. 15-year-old Danni Houchins was a child of these mountains. She knew the Gallatin River like the pulse in her own wrist. When she headed out that day with her fishing gear, no one worried. But as the sun dipped behind the Bridger Range, a terrifying silence set in. Searchers found her just after midnight. She was face down in the shallow waters of a fishing hole near the I-90 bridge. Danni was fully clothed. Her gear was scattered. And most hauntingly, an autopsy would later reveal there was no water in her lungs. She hadn't drowned. She had been drowned. In a true thriller, the monster isn't just the killer, it's the incompetence that lets him walk free. In 1996, the investigation was a disaster. They didn't protect the ground for footprints. They looked at a 15-year-old girl, and despite the glaring red flags, they called it an accidental drowning. They closed the book before they even read the first chapter. For the Houchins family, this wasn't just grief. It was a gaslighting. Her sister, Stephanie, watched as the world moved on, while a man with a name no one knew, slipped back into the Montana woods, invisible and emboldened. The case went cold. The files gathered dust. The river kept its secrets. For 25 years, the file on Danni Houchins sat in a cardboard box, a silent testament to a failure of justice. But in 2021, the box was opened by someone who remembered the smell of the river that night. Sheriff Dan Springer had been a rookie deputy in 1996. He had stood on that bank. He had seen the grief of the Houchins family firsthand. Now, with the weight of the badge and the authority of his office, he did what his predecessors wouldn't. He admitted the system had failed. He didn't just reopen the case. He declared war on the silence. The detectives started from scratch. They re-interviewed witnesses whose memories were now silvered by time. They combed through the original evidence bags, looking for the one thing 1990s technology couldn't see. And there, tucked away in the forensic archives, was a single microscopic thread of hope, a solitary hair. In 1996, a hair without a root was a dead end. In 2021, it was a biological roadmap. The sheriff's office partnered with Othram, a specialized laboratory that deals in the unsolvable. This wasn't a standard police DNA test. This was forensic genetic genealogy. The scientists didn't just look for a match in a criminal database because the killer had no criminal record. He was a clean man, a ghost in the system. Instead, they took that ancient DNA and uploaded it to public ancestry databases. They weren't looking for the killer. They were looking for his cousins, his aunts, his great-grandfathers. The investigation turned into a massive digital manhunt. Detectives and genetic genealogists spent hundreds of hours building a gargantuan family tree. They waded through dusty census records, scanned decades of Montana obituaries, and mapped out thousands of sprawling branches of DNA. Slowly, the shadow began to take shape. The DNA led them to a specific family line in Montana. The genealogists narrowed the thousands down to hundreds, then dozens, then a single household. They were looking for a male who would have been in the Belgrade area in September of 1996. A man who knew the river. A man who had lived a quiet, undisturbed life while a 15-year-old girl lay in a cold grave. By 2024, the digital bloodhound had stopped barking. It was pointing directly at a house in Dillon, Montana. But a DNA lead isn't a conviction. The detectives needed a direct sample. They began a high-stakes surveillance operation, tailing their suspect through his daily, mundane routine. They watched him pump gas. They watched him buy groceries. They waited for him to discard something: a coffee cup, a napkin, a cigarette butt, anything that carried his secret. When they finally secured a fresh sample and ran it against the hair from 1996, the lab results didn't just come back as a possibility. It was a 100% molecular match. The 28-year-old ghost finally had a name. The investigation was no longer a search. It was a trap. And for the man in the shadows, the sun was finally coming up. Paul Hutchinson. He wasn't a monster from a nightmare. He was a 55-year-old man living a quiet, unassuming life in Dillon, Montana. In 1996, he would have been a young man, a local who knew exactly where the quiet fishing holes were. For 28 years, he had eaten at the same diners, worked the same jobs, and breathed the same Montana air as the family whose heart he had ripped out. The DNA was a 100% match. The accident was officially a murder. The thriller reached its breaking point in August 2024. Law enforcement moved in. They didn't want a trial. They wanted an arrest. They wanted him to look into the eyes of the people he had spent 3 decades hiding from. But Hutchinson was a coward to the end. As the net tightened and the reality of his exposure set in, he took his own life before handcuffs could click shut. He died with his secrets, but he didn't die with the lie. Justice in this story didn't come in a courtroom. It came in the form of a sister's stubborn love. Stephanie Mollett never stopped fighting. She forced the world to admit that her sister's life was stolen, not lost. Today, the Gallatin River still flows, but the shadow is gone. The accidental drowning of Danni Houchins has been erased from the records. In its place stands the truth. Danni is no longer a cold case. She is a daughter who was finally heard. 28 years later, justice prevailed, and the girl of the mountains can finally rest in the sun. The truth didn't just solve a crime. It brought Danni home. Subscribe to the Black Box Files for more mysteries like this.